I had worked remotely for about 4 years up until February 2024 when I decided to come back to the office as I moved back to Australia from Japan. I work for a now large fintech startup that is international, a unicorn, and has been growing at an insane rate. And in my close to 9 years there, I have been in pretty much every role, from an engineer to a people manager to principal architect, which is my current job. For the longest time, I had dreamed about a full-time remote work. I had actually thought that it would make my life so much better, but TLDR, I found that hybrid, where you spend a few days per week in the office and the rest of it remote, was the best setup for me. And I'm actually leaning towards the view that it's also best for most people because I know better how you should live your life. Before you start a fire in the comments, the usual disclaimer: everything I say in this video is my personal opinion and is based on my personal experience. You don't have to agree with everything I say or anything I say, to be honest. Now you can go and tell me how wrong I am. Software engineering or adjacent professions, employees for medium to large sized companies, which is an important distinction because it means that no one knows every other employee personally. A member of a team of 4+ people collaborating on a project. I work in a company of over 1,000 employees, about a third being engineers, with engineering teams scattered around the world. Before 2020, remote work was allowed to a degree, but the pandemic forced it onto everyone. This obviously meant that everyone had to set up their workplace at home. All the meetings and daily rituals moved online. All the communications had to move online as well. And after the restrictions started to taper off and the team returned to working from the office several days a week, I moved to Japan and continued working remotely, with the rest of the team being in Australia. I actually got to experience both being remote in a fully remote team and being the odd one out, which reminded me a lot of my childhood. By the way, do you know what remote work is in Japanese? It's telework. Telework. First, let's understand what aspects of work are important when comparing in-office and remote. There are employers' and employees' points of view. The employer cares mostly about employee productivity, but more specifically the speed of delivery and the quality of delivery. And the latter is easy to measure and understand. Delivery speed isn't. It's a topic that probably deserves a whole another channel though, and I can't even post consistently to this one, so I won't go too deep. Let's just say the speed of delivery is usually measured comparatively to estimates and deadlines, and is often proxied with time spent at the tools or in the office, which is a terrible substitute, but it's much easier to measure and observe. And some people would say that because managers can no longer drop by your desk, they might distrust how much you're actually working. There has certainly been enough evidence on the internet of people taking up a second full-time job or spending time doing something else for the average employer to generalize and become suspicious. The truth is, it's very tough to measure personal productivity, absolutely. In fact, it's hard to even measure it comparatively to others. All that can be measured is how much time per day employees spend trying to be productive. To be fair, there are companies that take a more scientific approach, but I won't talk about it in this video unless I get sponsored by one of those companies before I finish recording. For employees, it is simpler because it doesn't need to be measured. Remote work can be way more convenient and less stressful, and most argue there's no real impact on your career, which is not always accurate, but it's a common point of view. So now let's go back to my experience. You can't really have a functional team without communication. When everyone went fully remote, we tried different measures like permanent Zoom rooms to replicate the always together vibe. It didn't actually last long. Most found them extremely distracting. Instead, we ended up with shared Slack channels where all the conversations had to go to. Zoom links for every meeting, ad hoc video chats, pretty standard now. So this paper effectively shows how, after switching to remote, a company's worker productivity per unit of time dropped by about 10 to 20%. So to compensate for it, they started working longer hours. And the researchers connected to how fragmented and interrupting communication is in a remote environment. You can probably do this mind experiment yourself. If you need to ask your colleague something that they would know better, in the office, you can ask the question and the response would generally be immediate. They simply can't ignore a person asking a question, even if you have coffee breath or haven't showered since your gap year. But remotely, messages might be delayed, or calls devolve into mini meetings, or you get ignored entirely because people are slammed, lazy, or just don't like you that much. The team I worked with was at the time spread across 3 countries: Australia, the US, and me in Japan, which made the communication even more sporadic. You can only communicate either during the overlapping hours or asynchronously, which means you send a message and then go do something else, waiting for the response. You also can't overhear something other colleagues are discussing and join the conversation. And a lot of knowledge is spread this way naturally. I, for example, have recently learned that cows apparently produce more milk when they listen to slow, soothing music. The impact on communication is easy to see, but why does it matter? Well, that's where we get to what actually deserves to be measured. Because the thing is, the individual is not nearly as important as the team. And if you look at the team as an organism, effective and timely communication is what makes the individual components work in unison. Having a good personal connection with somebody means enjoying the interactions with that person. So if you receive a DM with a question from them, you will prioritize answering it. If you are on the promotion committee or asked to provide feedback about them, it is unlikely they will be negative. I can keep going, but you get the gist. The productivity of absolutely every company ever run by humans is or was affected by interpersonal connections. The question is, how do you develop and maintain personal connections in a fully remote environment? In person, you will do activities unrelated to work together, and that's how you get to know each other. For example, I have lunches with my colleagues and we play table tennis together every day. Some companies like Gitlab do virtual team buildings. We even tried remote Friday drinks, which was the saddest thing ever. It didn't feel much different from drinking alone watching YouTube. My God, what a weird period of time it was. What doesn't work as well is creating new connections. Virtual team buildings are not nearly as engaging as in-person ones and feel kind of artificial and forced. It is especially difficult for junior team members who are still learning what being a part of a functioning team is like. But it actually did work well for me while I lived in Japan, but that's because I had been a part of the team for at least a year and had met my colleagues in person. And that leads me to my next point. It's not that no companies can make it work. There are examples like Gitlab that I mentioned before, 37 Signals, who pretty much pioneered the whole thing. But it requires a lot of intentional effort from both the company and their employees, as I said. Case in point, Gitlab maintains a gigantic publicly available documentation on remote work, which I will leave a link to in the description. And it is a central piece to their entire culture. These companies are pretty much architected around the concept of remote work. It's not a change that you can implement overnight. There are so many examples of businesses that tried really hard but admittedly failed, precisely because the required change to processes and habits was just too much. It definitely improves productivity if you work in isolation. As I said, collaboration is a different story. However, I had a few realizations that would probably be obvious to a lot of people, but I had to experience to understand. First, at home, the environment itself can be distracting. Even if there aren't any other people around, your habits tell you that you're in a space where you're supposed to relax. You have to develop quite a bit of self-discipline, especially if you don't have a dedicated work office space at home. What takes it to the next level is having kids around or family members that don't really respect or understand your boundaries. Some of my colleagues had to install locks into their home office door and buy noise-canceling headphones to make it work. There is an easy, albeit partial fix for the problem. It's working from a cafe. Partial because you can't replicate your 2025 best sleek minimalistic productivity setup with an external monitor and a clicky keyboard. So going back to the companies that, after trial, banned remote work, I found some examples of employees being fatigued by exactly that. An arguably smaller but real issue is how easy it is to gain weight when working remotely. I noticed that I was gaining weight sometime after the sudden switch to remote. Although I was very far from my peak of over 110 kilograms, which is probably a topic for another video, the difference was enough for me to pay attention to. I thought I was eating the same amount, but obviously because I wasn't tracking it, I had no idea what was happening. Part of it turned out to be related to the snacking habit that I had picked up. Call me weak, but I know I'm not alone. But another part was even more interesting. I was aware that to expand the same amount of calories, I would have to exercise more. Let me introduce a concept of NEAT, which stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis. This paper shows that even small, unstructured activities like standing, walking, taking stairs, or even fidgeting can add up to around 350 extra kilocalories per day in individuals who are more active. For comparison, that roughly equates to a 4 to 5 kilometer run every day. Again, just like the previous point, it's nothing that you can't negate with a conscious approach, but it is a lot of extra effort. When you switch to remote work, the strict separation between work and life starts to blur. In the traditional office setting, you may leave the work all behind when you walk out the door. But when your office is your home, as one of my friends said, it's not so much that you work from home, it's that you live in the office. According to this recent study, the issue is systematic. The authors introduce an interesting concept that they call work-life flow, which, unlike the traditional work-life balance, recognizes that in a modern, especially remote, work environment, the boundaries are much more fluid. So, for example, you might start your day checking emails over breakfast, work through your tasks, have a lunch outside, a work call on the way back, another few hours of work, and then seamlessly transition into family time. The key is managing that flow so the integration of work and life doesn't overwhelm. And the way to do that is to design your routines to make the switch easier. Personally, a dedicated single-purpose space is probably one of the most useful things I can recommend. I didn't have this luxury when I worked remotely from my tiny apartment in Melbourne, but when I moved to Japan and rented a Sun Eru DK, a 3-bedroom apartment, the video about which you can see here, I reserved a room for myself. Such lifestyle also, surprise, demands a higher level of self-discipline. Otherwise, one side of your life will end up dominating the other side. And this is the perfect segue to the conclusion. For those who didn't watch the entire video and skip to the end, here's the summary. To successfully implement remote work at a company requires consciously re-implementing processes and interactions that in office are taken for granted. And that intentionality is needed from both the company and the workers. So if you're set on going full remote, I implore you to go into it with awareness, and I hope you don't get burnt out by it as I did. Thanks for watching.